Welcome to the deep dive. If you've been watching the news around global trade, it all looks, well, completely chaotic. You've got high tariffs, threats against allies, markets going up and down. It feels impulsive, maybe even a little reckless.
It absolutely does. And according to the sources we're looking at today, that's entirely the point. Our mission here is to dig into the documented thinking of key advisors, people like prospective Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and the strategist Stephen Miran, and show you that this perceived chaos is anything but impulsive. It's deliberate.
Right. So we're looking at sources that lay out this argument that what we're seeing is actually phase one of a huge three-part strategy, a plan to basically tear down and rebuild the entire global economic system.
Exactly. This isn't just a minor trade dispute. This could be the start of a whole new global order, only the third major one since the Second World War.
That's a massive claim. You're talking about something on the scale of Bretton Woods in 1944.
Or the shift to neoliberalism in the early 1980s. These advisors are reportedly targeting 2025 as the start of this next big pivot. Bessent even has a name for it. He talks about dividing the world into green, yellow, and red buckets.
A completely new framework. Okay, so let's unpack that. What's the fundamental problem that the Trump team thinks they're trying to solve? Why do they feel the need for such a drastic overhaul?
The problem, in their words, is the deadly threat of American deindustrialization. The core goal here is to reverse decades of economic policy and turn the U.S. back into a manufacturing powerhouse.
And the numbers they point to, they're pretty staggering when you look at them.
They are. I mean, think about it. Back in the 1950s, manufacturing was about 28% of the total U.S. economy.
28%.
And today, it's hovering around 10%. That's a huge decline. It means the industrial capacity relative to the rest of the economy is a fraction of what it once was.
So why does that drop matter so much to them? The sources seem to point to two main reasons.
The first one is purely political. Deindustrialization just devastated the industrial heartland, the Midwest, the Northeast. That's the political base of this movement. So bringing industry back is, well, it's about fulfilling a core promise to those voters. And the second reason, which is maybe the main driver for someone like Bessent, is national security.
Okay.
Industrial capacity and military readiness are, the two sides of the same coin. You can't mobilize for a conflict or even sustain one if you don't have a strong domestic manufacturing base.
Then there's one comparison in the sources that really just stops you in your tracks.
The shipbuilding one.
Yeah.
It's astounding. A single state-owned shipbuilding company in Beijing built more commercial ships last year.
Just one company?
One company. Than the entire United States has produced since 1945, since the end of World War II.
When you hear that, you start to understand the urgency. If you can't even build the ships for your own Navy, trade policy stops being about, cheap electronics and starts becoming about national defense.
That's the whole shift in perspective, and it's the rationale behind all this chaos.
So, okay, the goal is clear. Reindustrialize. For security, for political reasons. But that brings up the big contradiction, right? If the goal is American strength, why on earth are you hitting allies, Germany, Japan, Canada, with tariffs? Why are you trying to break a system the U.S. itself designed?
Because to understand their plan, you have to understand the two systems they want to replace. The irony is the U.S. created both of them. And, well, both of them ended up, in their view, harming the American industrial base.
Let's start with the first one then, the Bretton Woods Order. That's 1944 to about 1973. How did that work?
So the structure was pretty straightforward at its core. All global currencies were fixed to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold.
Right.
In return, the U.S. gave the world two enormous things. First, military protection, that's NATO, security treaties with Japan and others. And second, it opened its massive consumer market to its allies.
So it basically let post-war Germany and Japan protect their own budding industries while they sold everything they could make to Americans.
Precisely. And in exchange, the U.S. got what's called the exorbitant privilege. Because the dollar was the world's reserve currency, America could spend way more internationally than it earned, and it wouldn't cause a currency crisis. It cemented U.S. dominance.
But the whole system had a fatal flaw, right? The sources call it the Triffin dilemma. This part gets a little technical, but it's really important.
It's the key to why it all fell apart. Just think of it like this. For the world economy to grow, it needed more and more U.S. dollars to do business.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the dollar was supposed to be backed by a fixed supply of gold. So if the U.S. printed enough dollars for global trade, people would lose faith in its link to gold. But if it stopped printing dollars to protect that link, it would choke off global economic growth.
So you either destroy your credibility or you destroy the world economy.
It was a trap, an impossible situation. And that's what led President Nixon to finally sever the dollar's link to gold in 1971. Bretton Woods was effectively over, and we moved into the second system, the neoliberal world order.
Right, from the early 80s until, well, basically today. This system was all about lower tariffs, capital flowing freely, and this is the key part, flexible exchange rates. What was the hidden cost here for the U.S.?
The flexible exchange rate, combined with everyone in the world wanting to hold U.S. assets because they're safe, it led to a perpetually strong dollar.
And a strong dollar is good for consumers, right?
Yeah.
Imports are cheap.
It is. It keeps inflation low. But it's like a massive permanent tax on anything you try to export. American-made products just became too expensive for the rest of the world to buy.
And that's the direct line to the decline in manufacturing.
It's the ultimate link. That strong dollar, which is the side effect of being the reserve currency, is what drove manufacturing jobs overseas. It's what created the China shock, especially after 2001. The U.S. got cheap goods and financial power, but it lost its industrial base and created this huge domestic inequality that, well, eventually led to the political shifts we've seen.
Okay, so that sets the stage perfectly for their solution. The big strategic goal for people like Bessent and Miran is to solve this puzzle. How do you reindustrialize the U.S. while also keeping that exorbitant privilege of the dollar being the reserve currency?
Exactly. It's something most economists would say is impossible, but they believe the old systems failed because the U.S. was paying all the costs. Their three-phase plan is designed to flip that script.
And this is where the grand plan really kicks in. Let's talk about phase one, what the sources call tariff chaos, the phase we're supposedly in right now.
Phase one is all about creating leverage. It's a show of force. When Bessent says tariffs are a third leg of negotiation, he means the U.S. is signaling that it's willing to accept pain, even in its own stock market, to achieve its long-term goals.
So the message is, we don't care about a temporary dip. We're serious about changing the entire system, and every other country that depends on selling to us needs to realize that.
Precisely. It's about forcing everyone, friend or foe, to the negotiating table by showing that the U.S. won't play the role of the predictable, stable anchor anymore.
Which leads right into phase two, reciprocal tariffs. Now, during the first Trump term, we saw countries get around tariffs by just shipping goods through, say, Mexico or Vietnam. How is phase two meant to stop that?
This is where Miran's strategy really comes in. He argues the U.S. has this unique position because everyone needs access to its market and to the dollar. Phase two moves beyond simple tit-for-tat tariffs and demands full reciprocity.
What does that mean, reciprocity, in this context?
It means if, say, another country puts a 10% tariff on American goods, the U.S. responds with a 10% tariff on all goods from that country. It's not about protecting one industry. It's about enforcing total parity. Miran's argument is that since they need our market more than we need their specific goods, the burden of that cost falls almost entirely on them, the exporters.
So you basically make it unprofitable to maintain any tariff advantage against the U.S., and it stops the whole proxy country game.
It's designed to. It maximizes the pressure before you get to the final negotiation.
And that final negotiation is phase three, the Mar-a-Lago Accords. This is the New World Order itself. And the goal seems incredibly ambitious. A weaker dollar for exports, but keeping reserve currency status. How do they even begin to solve that paradox?
Through a massive negotiated currency agreement, something on the scale of Bretton Woods itself. And this is where Bessent's green, yellow, and red buckets come into play as the actual framework.
Okay, we have to define these buckets clearly, because the whole thing seems to depend on other countries agreeing to be sorted into them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the green bucket is for your closest strategic allies. These countries would agree to anchor their currencies to the dollar. And this is the critical part. They would have to promise to actively strengthen their own currency whenever the U.S. dollar gets too strong.
So they would be managing the dollar's value down to help U.S. trade. Why on earth would any country agree to give up that much control?
The carrot is huge. Total, unfettered access to the U.S. market, special access to the dollar system, and the U.S. security guarantee continues. But here's the stick, and it's a radical departure. The sources suggest the U.S. might charge these allies a fee, a tribute, for that security. They would effectively become subordinate states.
Wow, so you pay for protection and you manage your currency to help U.S. exports, all in exchange for market access. That's the green bucket. What about the others?
The yellow bucket would be for neutral countries. They aren't enemies, but they aren't in the inner circle. They would face the reciprocal tariffs from phase two. The idea is to make them constantly weigh the cost of those tariffs against the benefits of, well, submitting to the green bucket.
And the red bucket is pretty self-explanatory.
Yes, the red bucket is for adversaries. China, Russia, Iran. They face maximum sanctions, huge tariffs, maybe even complete exclusion from the dollar system altogether.
So the whole theory rests on the idea that the pain of being in the yellow or red buckets will push enough major economies into the green bucket?
That's the gamble. If enough of them join, the U.S. could, in theory, have it all. The reserve currency privilege and a weaker trade-balancing dollar. Both goals solved at once.
Which brings us to the biggest question of all. Is any of this actually feasible? I mean, the theory is one thing, but can the U.S. really convince its allies to voluntarily become subordinate states?
And that all comes down to one word: trust, or maybe the complete lack of it. You're asking sovereign nations to hand over monetary control and pay for security. But if you're one of those nations, you're looking at America's track record. It designed two global systems and then broke them when they stopped being convenient.
Right. If you're an ally, why would you sign a binding long-term currency pact with a country that has threatened to leave NATO and has used sanctions against its own partners? The history just isn't there. It suggests the U.S. isn't a reliable partner for this kind of permanent structure.
And that could be the fatal flaw in the whole plan. The sources suggest that allies might just see the green bucket as too big a risk. If the U.S. changes its mind in 10 years, they're left with a managed currency and a huge security bill.
So if other countries call the bluff, if they refuse to join the green bucket, what happens then?
Then all the leverage from phase 1 and 2 just evaporates. And the U.S. is stuck with the same impossible choice it's faced for 40 years. Either give up being the reserve currency with all the power that brings, or keep the strong dollar and accept being dependent on foreign manufacturing.
So this whole period of chaos, this disruption, it isn't really about the tariffs themselves. It's about generating enough pain to force a negotiation that could literally rewrite the rules of the global economy.
That's the synthesis. The success or failure of this grand plan, this new order, hinges entirely on whether the U.S. can convince the world to trust it one more time, to accept a relationship that is explicitly subordinate.
Which leaves us, and you, with a final thought to consider. If you were the leader of one of those yellow bucket countries, let's say Germany or Japan, and you had just seen the U.S. tear up the last system it created, what possible guarantee, what treaty, what promise would you need to see to willingly join the green bucket? That's the geopolitical puzzle that has to be solved for any of this to become a reality.
When you grab, make your move.